So let's have our panel of participants head up here now. So you'll see some familiar faces on the panel, and you'll see a couple new ones. And so I'd like to ask the panelists that are new to the group to quickly introduce themselves. Miranda and Judy, if you wouldn't mind giving a quick introduction.
I'm Miranda Lowe, and I'm an exposure scientist, and I work actually at a place called the Institute of Occupational Medicine, and that's based in Edinburgh, so, you know, come a bit of a ways to come here. But I'm very interested in personal exposures, especially using sensors, but also in kind of the exposome, which was spoken about this morning.
There we go. And I'm Judy Qualters, and I am an epidemiologist by training. I work for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention at our National Center for Environmental Health, an agency for toxic substances and disease registries. It's a mouthful. My division deals with areas around air pollution, asthma control, the concept of trying to bring health and environmental and exposure data together and integrating and using it for taking public health action. So that's a short synopsis.
So I think everyone else has been introduced earlier. So we have time here to really get in depth and have some discussion. So I think we had a good setup there of an example of a way of monitoring pollution and putting it in the hands of consumers. We also want to engage the audience more, so please, if you have questions, go to the mics. But let's just start by thinking about what are some of the key challenges that we face, making sure that these pollution sensors and the data that come from them are useful to people, being both the consumer and to researchers that might engage with that. And I'll kind of let anyone kind of address with that. What are some of the biggest challenges they see? I'll call names if you don't volunteer. All right, Judy, go ahead.
Why not? So I'm going to talk about it from my public health hat on, from the professional side of it. And I think the challenge is what has already been emphasized today. The challenge for us is looking at basically what is an impending tsunami of data and trying to think about how do we make sense of it. First, what is the question that we're trying to answer with these data? You know, what is really that we're trying to get out at? Who are the users and the audiences that we're trying to target as a public health agency when I'm making information out of the data? So it's along that knowledge management paradigm. I have data, I want to make useful, digestible, actionable information, which has been mentioned previously. I want to build people's knowledge, and ultimately I want us to be able to take action, whether it is at the government level, the community level, or the individual level. So those all remain challenges, and I think that translating that data is obviously a focus of why we're here today. I think that for us too, it's sort of thinking about the data itself and the fact that we don't tend to process information in silos. So how do we take these types of data and link it to other information so that we can truly address what is driving health outcomes and protect people from and prevent those health outcomes from occurring. And then I think, again, I think I said this, but understanding our audiences. So if I am an asthmatic, I'm going to have a different interest and context in which I'm approaching wanting these types of data that Aircast may provide than if I am someone who jogs regularly in the afternoon. I mean, there are underlying contextual reasons of what's driving my need for that data. So trying to understand that so that I can better understand the user and provide them what they need.
Okay. Others?
So I just wanted to sort of follow up a little bit about that, about the users, because we've seen, I think Edmund showed in his slide, there's a whole plethora of different devices for example, air monitoring out there. And you can make your own and such. And I've been involved just the last couple of years in this dialogue, and it seems like, we had a citizen science project, it was a pan-European project, and there was, there's a lot of a learning curve, I think, in generating sensors that produce good data, especially with gas sensors for things like NO2, which is of great interest right now. I think the particle sensors are actually, probably performing a little better right now. But there's this big question, so for researchers, as to what level of data quality do we need or want from them? And because we could potentially actually monitor a lot more people, but it may not be, as mentioned, as accurate as something that's much more expensive. Although we have to be aware that it may be that we just know the uncertainties and errors in those more expensive devices a little bit better. So I think one of the challenges is that as a community we need to do a lot more testing. And I think I was at a symposium recently. There's a lot of call for more openness and kind of instead of just of sharing algorithms, because a lot of these sensors, really how the data becomes a concentration is actually kind of a data processing. It's some sort of model or something like that, and that's not always very public. And we might actually push the technology to be better by sharing more of it so that more people can actually work on it. But obviously, there is this question, I think, of some. I've seen from sort of like the government authority side where perhaps they don't like it as much because they're afraid that people are going to use this data and these sensors are not as accurate and such, and they'll sort of be challenged. So I think there's a balance that needs to be struck there.
So I'm going to go ahead and go to the audience, and we'll come back to Ed since I see a line building up there, which is great. So, John.
Thanks. John Bowles with NIEHS. And some of what I was going to ask has been addressed in the comments that have started. So it's been a really interesting morning and early afternoon. Thank you, everybody. And we've seen, this is about individual exposure information and how do you convey the risk. But what we've really seen is a lot of individual where we've gotten the real breadth and intensity and huge big data at an individual level. A lot of it has been physiologic or response, a little bit of exposure, but a lot of response. And when it comes to the individual exposure, most of it has been air quality. There's been a little bit else, but most of the individualized has been air quality. So my first, that's just an observation. My first question is, I've seen a lot of different metrics of the exposure, and with the air quality, we have two different things. We have, the fact that we're getting many points in time where most of our risk information is based on either annual or daily averages, and so translating the temporal aspect is difficult. And then, how do people? I was going to ask Mike, how do people deal with the 7 times ambient or there was another graph that you showed that it looked like it was particle counts where we don't really have that kind of dose response information as well. What's been your experience in terms of people's acceptance, frustration, challenge, feeling of the utility, where the translation to the individual risk from all this individual data is not totally clear cut? And then a really quick question, which is, I have some projects in India and people doing similar things, and does your air map deal with 250 micrograms per cubic meter?
No, it cannot. So that's one of the limitations, is that it's most accurate below 100 micrograms and best below 30 micrograms. So it's very much suitable for the United States. Someplace like India, it's not going to be as useful. Although in India, yes, you get those horrible days and horrible weeks, but it still would have some utility because frequently they are below 100 micrograms. But yes, that is a limitation of the device. In terms of, yes, so the raw output is voltage, and then we convert it to hundreds of particles per cubic foot, and then we convert it again to micrograms. And so there is difficulty in communicating what 7 times ambient air means, but it's probably clearer to people, generally speaking, than giving them micrograms per cubic meter. And going further than that is that I think there is fear in the kind of regulatory community as much as there is enthusiasm around these devices. And I think that a lot of people are talking about how this isn't really about an instrument. It's about a network of instruments. And further than that, it's not just about a network of instruments. It's what happens when you take that network of instruments and you combine it with meteorological data or land use data. And so in New York City, we've got the New York City Community Air Survey. And it's probably the largest in the world, if not, I know it's the largest in the United States, urban air quality monitoring initiative. And so it helped that right before our report came out, they also came out with and published an academic paper talking about the contribution of truck and bus traffic, diesel trucks and buses, to particulate matter pollution in New York City. And so we weren't alone in coming out with this report. I mean, most people would agree it's probably just common sense. You get a lot of trucks in the neighborhood, the air quality is going to be worse. But it was helpful that the Department of Health is doing this very innovative work in New York City, and that they actually published a paper coincident with the report. We certainly weren't collaborating or anything, but it happened to work out that way, where our findings basically were very much in line with what they were finding as well. But I think we have to start thinking about it not so much as, if you were doing Google's traffic prediction on your phone and you had one person using GPS, maybe you'd be really concerned about how accurate their GPS was. If you've got thousands of people or tens of thousands of people, well, you can have problems with your data, but if you know how to handle it properly, you can still gain insights from that. Now, you can't have complete trash. You can't have a random noise generator. But if you have some signal in there that you can extract, and then you can combine it with other data sets, there are insights you can pull from that. But that's where the real challenge comes in, because this data alone obviously is not enough. It might tell you something about your personal exposures. Is it going to tell you about what air pollution is like today or going to be like tomorrow or for other people? Not without a lot of serious analysis.
So I think that was a great response. I just want to add a couple of things to contextualize this in terms of how to really report this to people. The individual level data is really important, but the community level data is really critical. And in all of our projects, we hold community meetings as well as individual visits with people. And we provide the whole community, both participants in the study and others from the general public, with aggregate levels for that community. And we show that in relationship to a control community or to a state or a national or regional average, and give people simple bar graphs to show the differences between, say, indoor and outdoor contamination, or between one community and another. And what we find also is in these public meetings, there's a different dynamic. People interact with each other. They begin to raise questions. They actually sometimes posit new research questions for our team to follow. For instance, some of the contaminants you're looking at, maybe they fall under the California AB 32 regulations. And if some of the things you're testing would increase AB 32 contaminants, then that might be a way to stop the permitting process to allow the Chevron refinery to process a dirtier crude oil. So once you bring it to that more group level, people understand it and use it very differently. And one last thing to say is that I don't worry so much about the quality, because as Michael said, there are so many people out there doing this. When it becomes more and more crowdsourced, when there are more and more kinds of lay monitoring devices that wind up being very similar in their findings to more technical devices, to paraphrase the duck, if it looks like a contaminant and looks like a contaminant and acts like a contaminant, probably is a contaminant. And people are trying to find ways to just make scientific sense of what they already know is common sense. And at a certain point, if we begin to reject all that common knowledge, it's really obfuscation.
Ed, and then we're going to go over this side of our question. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just make a quick comment about why air pollution. I was really sort of glad that Michael showed some 311 and mentioned the noise situation in New York. We've recently been contacted by some community groups that are really interested in noise as a environmental pollutant, and we were very excited to see that within 1 week of putting an announcement out there asking if people were willing to host an air pollution monitor at their home, we had over 100 people sign up. So I think a lot of the work that we do in partnership with our communities is really fit for purpose. We try and design studies that address the pollutants of concern. It just so happens that air pollution is a big one for many communities.
Baruch, did you want to say something? Yeah. Okay, so I have an anecdote, a comment, and then two questions. I promise I'll be fast. The first is that I have some colleagues who work at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. They're behavioral economists, and they study enrollment in energy efficiency programs. And what they found in their research, is in the Sacramento area, that people who are already energy efficient are opting into energy efficiency programs, whereas those who aren't are not. So basically, you get less bang for your buck. And so I'm wondering if that might or could be a potential issue here. And so that leads me to my comment. When we talk about public engagement, communication, it seems like we're talking about two levels of engagement. One, and I really like Sarah talking about there being different publics. One is the general public who may not be as interested in some of these issues. And then we have a more engaged public. So these are interested and affected parties who are likely to use these types of devices, these technologies. My first question is, are those the publics that we should be reaching to? Or are we missing an opportunity to reach those who could really benefit from this type of information? And the second, because I now find myself in the Silicon Valley area, because I'm at Carnegie Mellon right now, but I moved to the Bay Area and work out of the office there. I'm going to ask this question, it might be a little provocative, but what do we think about using techniques such as gamification to entice people or motivate them to use these types of devices, to use smartphone apps where they can track their own risk exposure? So those are my questions.
So 2 questions to the group. Ed?
So I was thinking about some of the similar challenges actually from the previous section. It has to do with digital divide and the fact that so many of our technologies are geared towards the 1%ers. And similarly, with the quantified self movement, it's a very specific kind of individual, I think, that would be willing to, spend the amount of money. And so I have the same concerns as you, and I think, collectively as a society, we need to think about ways to incentivize these sorts of methods and approaches so that they're more accessible across a broader a range of communities and publics.
I'm going to make a quick comment. A colleague of mine at Emory University has been developing tools using the Raspberry Pi, really inexpensive computer, and going into high schools in inner city and teaching kids how to code and use these things to monitor. So I think that there's audiences we can get to that we just need to work harder at getting to them. And I think there's definitely ways of doing that. Other comments, Baruch?
Okay. Yes. So I found it inspiring to hear, Phil and Michael and Edmund and the other people who've gone out and spent the time in engaging communities. I think it's rare to find funding sources that reward that. And without that, we will end up, falling into the trap and missing the opportunity and not fulfilling the obligation, as Gabrielle has said. And thinking about it, I think it's impossible to teach design without teaching design. So if anybody, you can read. I think it's fun to read social science. Don't pretend that you've learned anything. I don't think you have to teach communication. I think your experiences iterate what we all find. We're all teachers, most of us, in one way or the other. If you have a chance to talk to people, you can explain what you do to anybody. And I think institutional mechanisms that force us out to talk to people and reward the people who go out and talk to people, I think that's what should be driving this movement. Not my university is full of computer scientists who are developing capabilities that are not driven by any needs. And I think if we start with the community and so the community can drive the technology. The community can also resolve these analytical questions. Well, what sort of calibration do we need to do? Well, if they're going to make a regulatory filing, then we need this level of calibration. But if they need to tell whether their neighborhood is worse than us, or it's really bad on this particular time of day, or their kid has an asthma attack when they cook without an external fan, then you need a much lower. Then that's a different scientific question.
Just speaking about drawing in new audiences, there is something like the Fitbit that's obviously marketed to consumers generally. I don't know that air quality instruments anytime soon are going to be a fit for that market. One, you can't put them in your pocket. Obviously, they wouldn't be able to take a proper sample. They're not, generally speaking, as accurate, although I guess the Fitbit's not so accurate either. But I think really what motivates a lot of the people who are going out and taking air quality measurements isn't necessarily, there's some people who bought air beams because they're concerned about what's happening right outside their door or inside their house, but a lot of it is regulatory agencies and community-based organizations, and that these are the type of groups that are adopting the technology, and they're doing it because there's a problem that they want to address. So I think that you're absolutely right that is that you start with the problem, you don't start with the technology. And so when we're developing aircasting and also HabitatMap, we get grant funding to run a project. And when we ran that project, we'd build out certain functionality in our technology, and then that would just be available to everybody else to basically adopt and use as they see fit. But our goal has always been to run programs with communities that are disadvantaged, communities that are overburdened, and so that's who we've reached out to work with. And then in terms of gamification, I think it's a great idea, especially for certain audiences like young people. I think it can really drive people to collect data, as we've seen in all sorts of different aspects. But it's expensive to operationalize something like that. If you look at all the different features, gamification, if you're really lucky, you just kind of hit the like Pokemon Go or something, everybody just started using it. But it's hard to find necessarily a formula for success that keeps people engaged. As you see, you were asking about whether anybody still uses their Fitbit. Well, most people use it for a little while, like a lot of wearables, and they just stop using it. And so I think gamification could drive this kind of long-term adoption and use, but it's hard to find a winning formula for it.
Judy?
So I just want to add one thing, and it's coming at it from a little different direction, because I think your question had to do with people adopting using these sensors. And I think just knowing about things about the types of work that have been explained here today, knowing about issues around some of the validity of what is available for sensors, that for a public health professional who is dealing with an issue that comes from the community, it could drive it the other way, where they can say, hey, I know these sensors are available. This is an easy way, in a relatively inexpensive way, since most public health folks do not have a lot of resources to work with, to try and get out there and see where there may be hotspots, where there may be problem areas, so that I can then take some action to address it. So that the drive may come the other way in terms of where those of us in the field know about it. We can say, hey, you wouldn't normally use this, but here's a way that we can try and identify what's going on.
Patrick?
Yeah, so I have a Fitbit that, in the event that I wear it when I sleep, tells me how well I slept and gives me a bunch of data about that. I have two problems with that data. One is one that we've talked about here quite a bit. I don't know what to do with it. I don't know how to make it actionable. So that's something that I think we've talked about a bit this morning and early this afternoon. The other problem that I have with that data, which we haven't really touched on, is I don't have a good feeling of how a change in that sleep quality, for instance, or particulate exposure, how changing my behavior to change that exposure is going to change my health outcome. So I was wondering if anybody had any thoughts on that. It's kind of I think it's a bigger nut to crack. I think we have some catching up to do on the science side of things. But I think for this information to be useful, I think that has to be communicated as well as the data itself.
I mean, the quickest answer I have, and it paraphrases things I've said so far, is that if we're talking about environmental public health, the message is like, let's push the curve, push the whole curve, not just try to figure out only where the outliers are. And certainly, if we find people with high exposures, we want to look more closely at what caused that. But in general, I think our goal is to reduce the contaminants, before we're seeing them, show up. So again, we want to push that whole curve over to the left, not just move individuals along the curve.
Yeah, I agree that we want less pollution exposure. But what's the impact of that going to be? What's the economic value you associate with that? What are you willing to sacrifice to get that, right? That's the kind of thing that needs to be quantified if we're going to actually use this to make
So
a
just
difference.
quickly, I mean, the studies that Dr. Birnbaum talked about before showing the economic impact of some of these contaminants, the work of Leo Trisandi and some of the others, it's very amazing how much this cost us, and we could really avoid a lot of costs if we get rid of these right from the outset.
Right. But I think this idea of interpretation for the user is that a user, the economic argument may not help them. And how do you do it for that user when Patrick's sitting there, wakes up in the morning, I'm like, well, so what? And there is information there, but how do you communicate that to people? Judy, you had a comment?
Yeah, did you?
Go ahead.
I'll
Either one.
comment. I think, we're talking about separate users. One user is you as an individual of that device and, how you derive useful information from it. But, the other sort of user is perhaps the research community that also wants to know, how good is that device, because, linking it to health outcomes, you're ultimately, I think, talking about epidemiology. And, I think there's a lot of people, many of us on this panel here would like to know that, yeah, Fitbit, is it any good in terms of evaluating sleep quality? Because we'll roll it into epi studies where we try and link sleep quality to any number of downstream health impacts, as opposed to a bed sensor or something like that that could be much more expensive.
Yeah. And I think you hit the nail on the head, too, in terms of what we deal with. A lot of times it's, okay, I understand that I have this exposure. What does it mean? What does it mean to my health? I think that was raised earlier this morning, too. And I think you raised it, too, with the, and the gentleman earlier when you were talking about the purple air, the resolution of the changes over time. So if it's red and then 15 minutes later it's green, do I understand what that really means to my health? I don't. So I think that while it may help us in thinking about reducing exposure, it also could help us build the science around and the evidence base around what these different types of exposure mean when we try to link them to a health outcome.
Okay, let's go to Mike now. And after Mike's question, I'm going to ask two from our online audience.
Yeah, I like the fact that we're separating this discussion between sort of community collected data that would be aggregated for research or making community decisions, separated from the individual one, because these really are separate uses, and I think that's been nicely expressed through this panel. One thing that does cross-cut both, which relates to the last thing, is it would be nice if we were collecting data that is directly health-related. So you're collecting particulate data, but wouldn't it be nice to take data on how often do you use your breathalyzer each day when you're in these different environments? And so I think we could be collecting a lot more personal data that is directly health-related, that could be actionable to the individual and also in aggregate as well. So that's a comment, and I recognize that has certain challenges associated with it, but in my mind, they're just technical challenges that could be, easily handled. So I guess I welcome some thoughts there. I don't know if any of you are running studies, any of these where the particulates, as I say, or just collecting breathalyzer or something like this, use would be nice. Is anybody running anything like that from that panel?
The researchers at Columbia University were doing that, where they were looking at, they obviously needed to know breathing rate in order to understand dose. And they also were doing a range of different tests that weren't just the real-time monitoring, but I think they were also bringing people into the lab. So it's definitely something that people are working on. We were a semifinalist for something called the My Air, My Health Challenge, which it was an NIEHS, EPA, Department of Health and Human Services challenge that said monitor one air pollutant at least and one physiological parameter and then talk about their association. And that's why we hooked up the Zephyr unit that you saw there. But that was kind of outside the scope of something we could do. We're not a well-funded research university, so it's great to see somebody like Columbia doing that. But for us, we were just trying to kind of build out the building blocks so that somebody could come in and do that kind of more advanced analysis. But I think you're absolutely right. And I think that, what I thought Dawn's comment was pretty interesting, talking about, she needed a bigger network. She had just one device, and you know, and you end up kind of saying, well, what can I do in my personal life? But really, it's more about what can we do in our civic life to change policy. And so I do think that, you know, this is an interesting divide, you know, where, you know, what can we do at a personal level? Maybe that's the low-hanging fruit. And then what do we try to enact at a kind of the policy level? Because certainly it's great that, you know, people will commute more often or ride their bikes to combat global warming, but we all know that that's not going to solve the problem.
So I could just, we did, not with something like AirBeam, but we did collaborate with Emory a couple years ago now, but there are some publications I could share that actually placing monitors in cars and sending people off on their commutes, and then did actual biomonitoring afterwards and looked at specific biomarkers and forced expiratory volume, forced volume of air being exhaled, and did some analyses based on that to see what the impact of the levels of pollutants in the commute had on the actual markers of health, and then after a time, how did that change?
So I think that was actually a really good question, because there have been quite a few studies in the research using sort of the older style instruments where you do kind of panel studies where you monitor their exposure, and then you take, you know, measures of heart rate variability. You can measure blood pressure in real time. And there's a kind of a classic study where they walked volunteers through a very polluted street in London and then through a park, and they measured, again, lung function and various biomarkers afterwards. It's interesting because I think there's not, from some of the literature I've seen, for example, for cardiovascular effects, you get kind of very variable results. And not all studies show the same, you know, is it this measure of heart rate variability or other? But it is something that maybe we have more power to do on a larger scale now with sensors, and perhaps it's sort of a combination of this personalized medicine and the exposure sensors that could sort of help us do this in a better way in the future. So that's a good point, thanks.
Okay, let me go to some of these online questions. So Mark asks, first comments, it's great to measure the data, but if we spend most of our time indoors, why don't we just filter our air better? And I guess at the same point about driving in a vehicle, right? The idea of having your windows up and the air conditioning on is better for that exposures, but this gets to the sort of like actionable items on that. Is that, you know, when you look at that overall exposure, is that one thing we should be thinking about? And a quick follow-up to that was, the question is, are early adapters of sensors like AirBeam and Fitbit actually acting as sentinel animals for their community? For those laboratory people, get that. I mean, it is something where they are providing some information for the larger community as they go through. So just, I don't think there's really a solid question. I mean, the idea is that the sort of idea of filtering is that there are some things that could be done, and you know, what is the most efficient and effective thing for a consumer to do? So, you know, and kind of the experiences, I mean, obviously, yes, putting another air filter in someone's house could do that, but where is the biggest trouble? And I think, for example, with some of the commuting examples, is that those were probably some of the more dramatic pieces of it. Ed?
Yeah, I'll make a comment about, you know, one of the studies that we're doing, which it's an indoor air quality study where we're using low quality or low cost, moderate quality PM sensors within the homes of asthmatic children. Okay, so it's an indoor air quality study. It just so happens that we recruited 50-50 families that have cigarette smoke in them versus those that don't. And it's just mind-boggling to think that, you know, there would still be families that smoke even though they have an asthmatic child in their household. But one of the hypotheses that we have is that when we show them their air quality levels and link it to their smoking patterns, as well as cotinine levels within the biosamples and carpet samples and whatnot, we'll paint a clearer picture for the household why it may be important to reduce cigarette smoke as a potential trigger for their child's asthma. So, you know, sometimes the very obvious solutions may not be acceptable for certain households until they sort of grasp that it's important for them.
Another online comment from Mark again is, if people are familiar with like the Waze app where you can avoid traffic and things, is that, for someone with asthma, could you actually build in some of the pollution pieces to help direct them around that, either when they're walking or driving, to avoid those places? I mean, those are things that are obviously technically quite feasible at this point. Oh, wait, no, she's been waiting longer. Let's go over there.
Actually, the last speaker just said what I was going to say. WAS is an interesting learning tool because the user puts new information in for risk, right? So if we could design our dosimeters, so to speak, our exposure assessment tools, to not just pick up the metrics for the exposure itself, the contaminant, the part per million, the decibel level, whatever we're trying to do, I would like to see also the risk factor side for that specific endpoint also included by the community. Otherwise, you lose the interpretation, don't you? So I'm inviting us to sort of expand our tool sets here and think about ways of not just capturing the precision and accuracy of peaks and valleys, but also what the context in which we see them. And we can collect that data like WAS does. Police, holes in the ground, not just how fast you get there, right?
Mm-hmm. So, Gary?
Yeah, so the Newtown Creek Superfund risk assessment, it doesn't surprise me it didn't turn out with any health effect. As someone who grew up in the Corona Flushing area and rode my bike around there a lot, we just knew to stay away from it. Was dead fish, smelly, very trashy, and you wouldn't go fishing. Maybe you have stories of people who fished from there, but we certainly didn't. So anyway, the exposure probably could have been a lot higher in different kinds of more pristine kind of river, but not the creek. But anyway, my comment or question is more regarding what's the path forward to turn HabitatMap into something that regulators would pay attention to? Because right now, we regulate PM based upon regional high-vol monitors for particulate matter comparing to 24-hour or annual average NACs. And if you have properly calibrated thousands of reports coming in on what's happening at an intersection, I mean, it's great that de Blasio did that with the garbage contractors, but that's a very local decision. I mean, how do we make something like HabitatMap turn into something that state level, national level regulators would pay attention to?
So the EPA put out something recently called the Smart City Air Challenge. And what they asked is that they gave out a little bit of money for a really big project where they asked groups to deploy at least 250 monitors in a community. And so we put in a proposal, and one of the things we're proposing to do is distribute 250 monitors, capture the data, and then combine it with the New York City Community Air Survey's land use regression model that has very spatially resolved maps that are based on land use that talk about different types of pollutants, all the different criteria air pollutants. They say, where are the truck routes, where are the oil heat burning buildings, et cetera, et cetera. And so, yes, the airbeam data in and of itself is not going to be substantial enough to be able to make a claim, and it never will be in and of itself. And why would you want it to? You're not making regulatory decisions with it, nor do you need it to. I mean, the reason that we have the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, the reason there's very strict siting guidelines about where you site monitors and what type of monitors they can be, is because you have a very specific decision-making process you're following through with. And obviously, EPA recognizes that, and they say, if you're doing a community air monitoring study or a personal exposure monitoring study, you don't need the same level of accuracy. But I think that we do want to be able to harness the information coming from the air beams to fill in those, which people were talking about earlier, the data gaps. Edward was talking about, you've got 2 monitors in this entire county, and now you've just increased it by 20 times by putting out these 40 monitors. And so I think there's insights we'll gain. I don't think that this is going to necessarily have a bearing on, whether you're in compliance with the NACs, but I think it has a lot of relevance to, things like pollution avoidance on a personal decision-making basis, choosing your route or changing the behavior in your home, whether it be not smoking or opening your windows or getting a hood that vents to the outside. And I think it has a lot of meaning for the local policy context, that there's all sorts of decisions that cities need to make about cleaning up air pollution, but not just cleaning it across the board, but doing it in a way that's equitable. So in the case of garbage zoning, well, that truck leaves an environmental justice community from a transfer station or a garage and then drives through the city. Now with garbage zoning, that route is shorter, but the truck still leaves and comes back to the community. That's the same truck trip. And so garbage zoning in and of itself is not going to improve air quality. It's going to improve air quality across the city, but it's going to do it disproportionately in wealthy communities like Midtown Manhattan, where there's a lot of commercial businesses. It's not going to have the same impact on environmental justice communities. So we need to make sure that when we implement that policy, we do things like, if you want to win this zone, then you got to drop your trash at this marine transfer station instead of putting it at a land-based transfer station in an EJ community that's going to truck it out. We'll put it on a barge in a community that's closer to where you're doing the pickups. And so I think there's a lot to be said for collecting this data to inform local policy decisions. I don't think they're going to have as much impact on regulatory decisions because you already have a really great network to do that that's shown to be effective. Okay. Well, good to hear from you. I don't want to say this.
So I was reminded that I'm supposed to remind the questionnaires to identify themselves before they ask the question. One follow-up question from online was asking whether plans would be adopted to place monitors at inner-city schools or daycares as a prerequisite for other future funding. And this idea of incentives, if you want to build something up and say that you take advantage of that, I think it is something which I think we'll talk more about tomorrow and some of those sort of policy issues and things, but I think there are certainly opportunities for that. So,
hello, my name's Patrick Burke. I'm a design analyst and architect with an office in New York called Plastarc. So I've been kind of approaching a lot of the research from the standpoint of how the built environment gets made and then goes on to kind of form institutions, behaviors, bodies, these sorts of things. So I've been, on the one hand, quite interested in the focus of the scope of a lot of the research and how it's been primarily at the urban scale, though I probably, or I would anticipate that a lot of it is also done within buildings as well. But I was wondering if there has been any debate or if there are any implications as to where the devices are located. That is to say, does it matter whether the data is collected on the body or on the built form? And would that change how we make sense of the data? And then the second question is that there's been quite a bit of attention spent on the accuracy of the environmental factors, which is quite understandable. But I was wondering, has there been equal attention spent on maybe spatial resolution, so as to where those data points are precisely collected? I appreciate at the urban scale it has different implications, but when you're close to a building or even within a building, which is where it becomes really difficult with GPS, although there are other methods, I was wondering if those other methods are involved and incorporated into the research.
Let me speak to just that one point about, does it make a difference if it's in the body or if it's outside the body? I think we had a big shift in the last 15 and 20 years from the 55-gallon oil drum to the vial of blood, and the sense that there were things you could see out there where the contaminants were left. Now they've worked into your body. Right around the time that CDC started NHANES was when the Environmental Working Group did their first biomonitoring study. And there was a flurry of other advocacy biomonitoring studies around the world beginning from that. And I think when people began to understand that these were in their body, it felt a lot different. There was a sense of embodiment. I mean, literally what that term means. It was much more tangible. And I think it created a huge public awareness. I mean, Bill Moyers went around the country doing these town hall meetings after he was part of that first EWG biomonitoring project. And it was just amazing. I mean, he did a film about it, and it was amazing how much attention that got. So I do think that that one part's important to remember, that we really get motivated to change because of that personal sense. So not in my backyard anymore, but not in my veins.
If I may clarify, though, is there any difference in terms of where the contaminants are measured from, not necessarily where they're located? That is, could we use buildings as devices for measurement?
I mean, well, in a simple sense, so some people are saying, like, to save money, let's see if we can do dust wipes for flame retardants, very inexpensive, as opposed to worrying about taking blood. And if you've got a very high correlation between the serum level and the dust wipe, then that's really good. You save people a lot of aggravation. And if that's a high correlation, that's pretty good. I mean, the idea is reduce the exposure. Don't worry so much about the perfect correlation there.
I think you have a good point, because the location's very important, not just from a sense of where the sources are and what the concentrations differ from location to location. Indoors and outdoors, there's been a lot of focus on outdoor air, but indoor air, for most of us, we probably spend 90% of our time indoors, at home, at work, wherever else, or commuting. So I think it's intriguing to use things like buildings as a way of measuring air pollution. Could they be part of a network, for example? Can we, we already put reference monitors or just monitors in general on buildings, so why not use more of them, for example? Why not measure indoors and outdoors as well, so that we have a better sense of what those relative contributions are? And it's not limited. I think when we look at indoor air and outdoor, but we focus a lot on particles, NO2 and things like that, but there's a lot of other compounds that are actually quite important that we don't look at on a regular basis and that we don't have sensors for. But I think that's a good point.
Yeah, I think too, when you think about the sort of internal measures, is the other advantage is that you address some of the individual vulnerability, because we could all be exposed to the same thing in this room, but have very different levels in us, which brings in issues of, toxicokinetics and their microbiome effects. So I think it's the idea of balancing both of those. But I wanted to come back to this sort of spatial resolution piece. Is, it's something that people talk a lot about, but do we really know what the optimal spatial resolution of measuring these things is? Do we need to be at the individual level? Is it a community, block level? Comments on that?
Yeah, for some things, I think we have some understanding. For instance, traffic-related air pollutants. There's not a single traffic-related air pollutant, but rather it's a mixture of a variety of things which have different, unfortunate spatial characteristics associated with it. So for things like, black carbon and ultrafines, the spatial gradient's very short next to roadways, whereas if you look at PM 2.5, it's an aged aerosol, and so it's going to be more diffuse. NO2 is somewhere in the middle, probably, similarly for black carbon. And then, for things like, ozone, you don't expect it to be very high next to roadways because it needs to form photochemically, so it's going to be high away from roadways. So there's a lot going on with respect to kind of these spatial resolution questions, and that's just, air pollution. And then obviously how the wind blows in relationship to the source also matters. So difficult question to answer. But this question about, can we leverage the infrastructure to do sensing? I heard a fascinating talk by a colleague, Josh Apte, who's at UT Austin, talk about his work where he's been partnering with Google to use their street view cars to do environmental sensing, and talk about amazingly detailed data, because he's leveraging infrastructure that's routinely going through the environment to collect measurements. So if you're interested in these questions about spatial resolution and how fine is fine enough, Josh is a great person to talk to, because he's got that kind of very detailed data.
Hi, Dawn Nafis from Intel. I think the spatial discussion, if I can put it back together with the earlier discussion about Fitbit sleep, one of the things this is making me think about is that it's worth sort of, we can now sort of put some nuance around, where do we need to put our efforts, in the sense of, there are some projects where the signal is absolutely clear, right? So my a good friend, Mark Bolin at SUNY Buffalo, did a deployment of E. coli sensors in Indonesia, in wells, right, and for drinking water, and thinking that some wells would have lots of E. coli, some wouldn't, and there would be whole social networks of sort of sharing well water, right, which is what people do, actually. And it turns out there was so much E. coli everywhere, right? There's no sharing clean wells. There's no such thing as a clean well, right? I mean, the situation was so dire. We know the signal, it was clear. And so in that scenario, what you need is deployment and action, right? In the scenario of the Fitbit sleep, right, I think what actually needs to be built here are sort of really robust communities of interpretation, right? So, I mean, the thing about Fitbit is it's not just one data set. You can parse that in a lot of different ways, and you might find different things in different parsings. You might find you're waking up, as one of my QS friends did, that you're waking up at 3 in the morning every night, and that might be from, something in your house, right? So I think the problem there is very different, right? It's absolutely there are different audiences that need to be communicated with, but also there's not one interpretation or one path or one next step, and it's not even 5, right? And so actually, communities that can deal with, the multiple possible directions in which these things are indicating, right? I mean, there's some subtlety there, and we can work our way through subtlety, right, with that social connection. So it was a comment.
Baruch.
So that I think I like the phrase communities of interpretation. You will find people who will read one oversold op-ed in the Sunday Times book review and think that they've got the magic bullet for explaining something important, and then you'll have citizens groups who will get detailed explanations and recognize that it's and not feel confident in being able that they've actually understood it, and they need somebody, authority, who can kind of talk them through it. So I'm a big fan of responsible people. I think you tend to find more in the public health community than in the social science community. People who are interested in the problem rather than being interested in the research, in conversation with people who help them to interpret their reality, so they feel empowered to press the authorities for better evidence. And I think, just as, my colleagues have done, they do this, full time, the act of going and talking to people, says a lot. The idea that people have ownership on the data says a lot in terms of who we are and who they are. And I think that those kind of interactions really ought to drive this. So I've been trying to think of, but that's very narrow band. I mean, that's getting to know people. You have to have an incentive structure for doing that. I was trying to think of what could you do more generically. So let me take like 2 minutes to talk about something from a completely different world. So we do work with people in the medical area, in the medical school at Pitt, that there's been pressure to look at non-physiological monitors of health, like the actual measures of well-being, as opposed to the biomarkers that are then related to them. Tremendous proliferation of different measures, in some sense play the role of this proliferation of personal environmental monitors, and some were good and some were bad, and nobody knew how good they were. So NIH put $50 million into a program called PROMIS, P-R-O-M-I-S. If you've got a measure of sleep quality, if you can demonstrate the psychometric properties of your measure, then PROMIS will include it in its database, and it will not only do that, it will use item response theory to develop an efficient online, adaptive testing, an efficient online version of your measure that other people can do. So nobody can regulate the measures, but you can give priority to those who've done their work well. So I wonder whether this community might, between government and industry, all of whom have an incentive to get the, philanthropic community incentive to get this right, might come up with a set of uniform testing standards that people, people who have those, meet those standards, get to have their device registered. And as a bonus, somebody will do a professional job of communicating those risks and benefits. Will do, in effect, the quality of those measures. In effect, do for these measures what the drug fact box is doing for pharmaceuticals.
Question over here.
Hi, my name is Lorraine Burton. I'm with the Indoor Environments Division at EPA, and I'm sort of going back to this very first question, the key challenges in making sure the sensors and data integration are understandable and useful. From the perspective of the community projects and everything that you all have talked about, perfect. What the calls I get are the individual. They are the person who got these sensors that are now marketed everywhere, can pick them up, they come in and they get a number and they call and they say, well, what is this number? Or somebody has told them, well, this number is higher than the next number, so is this bad for me? We don't have regulatory numbers indoors. Can any of you kind of give me, because my job is kind of to help with that communication, so I would love your great brains, and I will be taking great notes on ideas for what do we do to help those folks understand. I think this is a great thing for our community projects and where you can have the researchers there and community conversations, but that's not the reality that now that you can buy them everywhere I'm facing. So any help would be greatly appreciated.
I think one of the things that we often tell people is that if it's a research project, I mean, that's different than maybe the calls you're getting from people who on their own have gotten a sensor. But if it's a research project, we say, thank you for being part of this research project. We don't know. Evidence is growing that there are relations to health effects. Most people who are exposed to this do not get those health effects. And many things that didn't used to be regulated now are regulated. And it's only because people like you participated and contributed that we know more. And I think that that gives people a sense both of a little bit security that they aren't about to get sick, and also it gives them a sense of civic participation in some larger scientific enterprise.
I think that would be a terrific research project. I think for the cost of the staff time that is wasted on spent on trying to deal with these questions, you could come up with a scripted, responsible way of telling people what to do. You could pool the advice. You could start as hypotheses by pooling the advice of the people who are doing it already. You could test it with different groups. You could have a routine feedback mechanism of seeing how you're going, and use that as a way of kind of seeing what is coming out. And you could give people a feeling that they're being empowered rather than they're being let down once again. So I think this is a straightforward, cheap project. But you need research, you need evidence, you need systematic follow-up, not just intuition.
So our team actually has something that addresses a little bit of that. Once we started to realize that we're going to be doing biomonitoring report back with larger groups than our sample sizes of 50, like the whole California biomonitoring program, Silent Spring Institute folks developed something called the Digital Exposure Report Back Interface, DERBI, and it's a computer version. I actually will show a slide tomorrow at the panel about what it looks like on the researcher side, but one of the slides I showed before, that CHDS report back, that comes from it. We're able to track when people get their results back, looking online, how much time they spend looking at personal health information kind of things, at prevention. We have a project looking at self-efficacy and other kind of psychological measures to see the relationship. If people feel that they have a greater self-efficacy, it's very likely that they will have a different response to a higher exposure figure they get. So all these are questions that are just in the infancy of how we deal with people's understanding of exposure. But believe me, we're on it, and I'm glad that Baruch mentioned that this is open territory for lots of empirical research.
And I would just add that you guys have great prevention messages, regardless of the whether it's tied to a personal sensor or whether it's tied to what's going on in the ambient air. And I think this is a great opportunity when folks call to actually provide those prevention messages to them and to say, I don't know exactly what this means, but this is how you could reduce your exposure.
And that is the way we answer. But I think the reality is now that people are seeing that there are sensors, it's like, well, what do you want me to do? I just want to open my window. I want to know why. I want to know what. And, you know, I love that the research is coming, but real people are asking every day, and they're not community research people. They are people who can't get their landlords to move or something else. And so when you're doing your research, if you can take your conclusions and your discussions to some of that, it would be greatly appreciated.
Hi, Simafin, NIEHS. I also wanted to comment on this first question, and I wanted to cite two of the research projects that you've already heard about today. Edmund Seto's and Phil Brown's, is that these research projects were constructed to allow for a great deal of community engagement, particularly in the translation of the in the translation of the findings. And the answer to how might, what roles might community engagement take is that I think that it is not necessarily the responsibility of scientists to communicate. We've got some great communications people who work with scientists. They have given us some very good structures for that. And part of that structure is that you have to listen and recognize that there's a lot of variability in the audience. And that I know in the Derby project and in a lot of the work that Phil Brown has done, that they listen very carefully to people in various communities and at various levels of socioeconomic status and scientific literacy about how to make messages more understandable and useful to people. And I think in the Research to Action project that program officers like myself, when we construct programs, we need to put requirements on these programs that the community partners in research have their health literacy, their environmental health literacy raised, empowered through the course of the project, that they have responsibility for translating the findings. That's the only way to sustain this information beyond project terms. And so, and I understand that not everybody's in a situation to conduct research, but the more people in the public who become scientifically literate, the more they'll be giving useful feedback about what kind of information they want and in what format. Thank you.
Okay.
Melissa Perry, George Washington University. What a stimulating discussion. And one of the comments that was raised by our EPA colleague and then Phil very poignantly responded to has to do with the interpretability of these data and the actionability of these data. And while Phil, I've always been very rapt by the notion of community empowerment, and that the more that we can collect data that can inform us as individuals, the more empowered we can be and even potentially more efficacious. I have to tell you a very quick story about my experience working with farmers in the early 90s, where I somewhat naively went into farm communities and recognized that there's a lot of pesticide exposure happening. And if in fact I could just take urine samples and then detect metabolites of pesticides and then report that directly back to the farmers, that's all they needed, as I naively thought, that they would start to don the protective gear and read those excessively complicated labels, that all of the things that they had to do to keep themselves protected, only to discover that whatever I was feeding back was not that motivating, and that it really didn't affect the change in behavior. So as Baruch pointed out in a very important and enlightened way, this notion of being excessively rational in our behavior, and this promise of, if I am given this information, therefore I will then change my behavior to correspond to see a predictable reduction in my exposures, I think we really need to think about that very carefully and be as realistic as possible about that.
Well, those are excellent closing remarks for this session. We now have a 15-minute break. We will do another case study and follow with more discussion. So if you had other questions or thoughts, there'll be plenty more time to deal with that. And does Keegan come up here to make an announcement?
Just a quick announcement. Our cafeteria is staying open for you. If you would like a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, or a quick snack, go now. They will be open until 3:45. They're on the 3rd floor.
I was hoping that was the case.